But I'm going to just go ahead and introduce myself real quickly and then turn it over to Pete Hamill. So my name is Clark Friedrichs. I'm part of the executive team at Green Let Go, and one of our missions is to continue to support coaches, experienced coaches in the world. We do a lot of training with coactive coaching, and do some training. We do training with CRR Global for their team coaching and systems coaching, and we want to also support people when they're finished with that journey to learn more. And so tonight, this afternoon, we have the great opportunity to get into somatic coaching. And today we have the incredible Pete Hamill, who is a senior faculty at the Strozzi Institute. He's a master somatic coach. He's written a book that's available on Amazon, and he's an all-around just a great person and a great facilitator. So I want to turn it over to Pete and let Pete explain a little bit about what we'll be doing with here, and also what we'll be doing in the future in May with somatic coaching and bringing the body back into coaching. Okay, so I'll turn it over to you, Pete.
Thank you. And thank you for all those superlatives. I don't think I've had so many superlatives used about me in such a short space of time. So thank you for that. So in terms of today, what we're going to do is we're going to do a little bit of an exploration of somatic coaching, what that is and the perspectives that I take on that. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the program that we've got coming in May and how that's going to be structured, the kind of stuff that I'm going to be covering there. So that's really what I want to do, is give like a good introduction to it and make sure you have a sense of what it is and have your questions answered. Those of you who don't have videos on, if you are in a place where you can put your video on, could you do so? Because it's something very humanizing about just having everybody's face here and the possibility of connection. So that would be the first request that I'd make. The second thing that I'd say is, if you want to say something during the program or during this webinar, I'm really open for that. Kind of come off mute and say hello and say what you want to say. That's great too. So I just want to create permission and an openness for all of that, because I think there's that's part of what we're here for, really, is to do some work together. So let's just start off. I'm guessing. So if we get a bit of a sense from everybody here, I'd like to kind of get a bit of a poll of where you are in relation to somatic coaching and that work. So first of all, those of you who are on camera, can you put your hand up if you would regard yourself as doing somatics inside of your current coaching practice? Okay, so we've got one, two, three, we've got a few, lovely. Okay, a few then hand up if you are somebody who has some familiarity with somatics, but feels like there's more work to do to bring that into your practice. If you put yourself in that kind of category. There's a few people. And then finally, hands up if you kind of heard of it, but that's about it. Not much more than that. A couple. So most of you have some sense of it. That's really good. That gives us a good starting point to work from. So in that case, based upon that, I'm going to suggest we start off with doing some somatic practices together, just as a way to ground ourselves and be present here as a community together. So I'm going to invite you to either do this standing or sitting, whichever you prefer. I'm going to go for standing. And we're just going to do a centering practice, one of the basic, most foundational practices of this work. We're just going to do this together. As I say, standing or sitting, whichever is appropriate for you and the environment that you're in, all of that is good. And so just as we kind of come together in this group, just let your attention drop down into your body and out of your head, out of the thinking self and into the feeling self. And just take a moment to arrive inside yourself. Letting go of whatever you might have been coming from, whatever it is that might be concerning you or on your mind, and just allowing yourself to arrive here in this moment with this group. And as you do so, just notice what there is to notice in your body. Tension, spaciousness, numbness, tingling, hot, cold. Whatever it is, all of it's welcome. But just take a moment to notice what there is. And then we're going to center in the body's 3 spatial dimensions. So the first dimension that we're going to center in is the dimension of length, extending up and relaxing down. So almost like somebody's pulling on a hair on the top of your head and extending you up. Just allow yourself to inhabit your full length. Imagine perhaps putting some air between your vertebrae and extending your spine so that you're standing or sitting fully in your length. But we want to do that without holding ourselves up, without forcing ourselves up. So we need to relax down at the same time. Relaxing the eyes, the jaw, the shoulders, down into the stomach, down through the sphincters and down into the legs. And allowing your weight to go through your feet into the floor. And really just allow yourself to experience that feeling of connection with ground. Extending up, connecting down. In the Chinese tradition, it's the connection between heaven and earth. How can we hold both of those at the same time? An expanded vision and a grounded connection to reality. In this work, we often talk about this, the domain of length, is the domain of dignity. And we do that because we know that the first thing that happens whenever our dignity is taken away is that we collapse. And so there's something about how do we hold ourselves with dignity, and what's our experience as we hold ourselves with dignity? And if we don't hold ourselves with dignity, how do we expect others to? So just allowing yourself to experience what it's like to stand in your dignity today. And then we're going to center in width, the second spatial dimension that we live in. So taking a moment and just allowing yourself to feel your own boundaries left to right. Breathe into your chest, but as you do so, your chest and stomach, as you do so, allow your ribcage to expand in the left to right domain. And really get a sense of allowing yourself to take up the space you're due in the world. Allow your chest to open and allow yourself to really be visible. And take a moment and notice what it's like to be visible. Notice what it's like to take up the space you're due in the world. And notice how you tend to hold your boundaries. Do you hold your boundaries in? Or are you able to hold your boundaries in an effective way? Can you take up that space? Finally, we have the domain of depth. As a human being with the majority of sense organs in the front of our body, we have a tendency to orient to the future as ahead of us and the past is behind us. And so we see that there's orientations to the world that are expressed through how we hold ourselves in depth. For some of us, we're leaning forward into the world. It's like it can't come at me fast enough. You see some people as they drive where they're leaning over the steering wheel, trying to get there just a little bit sooner. And then on the other side, there's kind of leaning away from the world. It's like it's all coming at me a bit too fast. So try to find a place where you're neither leaning into the past nor leaning into the future. A place where you're in the present, where your weight is balanced across the heels and the balls of your feet. And then take a deep breath down into your stomach. And a nice long exhale. And then finally, just take a moment and connect with the body's center of gravity. That's a point about an inch or two below the navel. If you put your hand with your thumb resting on your navel, your hand will rest nicely on your body's center of gravity. So just allow yourself to feel from that place, to feel your body from your center. And let your hand drop away, but keep your attention there. And then notice your mood in this place. Notice. Let's sit down and let's come back together. So what I'd like to do is to talk a little bit about somatic coaching, at least the perspective that I would hold on that. And I want to acknowledge that there are multiple perspectives and multiple routes into somatic coaching. So that I think is a piece of background, which I think is worth acknowledging. So in the last, I would say in the last 5 years, there's been a huge amount of interest in somatics and somatic coaching within the coaching world. It's kind of up there with neuroscience as something that people are getting very curious and interested in. And there are different approaches to doing somatics. All of them are helpful, but I want to make clarity about where I would stand in the field. So there are some approaches to somatics which are very much oriented around helping people manage themselves when they're triggered and using the body as a means to manage when situations come along that are challenging, triggering, the whole kind of amygdala hijack conversation from neuroscience. And there's a field of somatics which is very much based around that. What I would distinguish the work that I do and that comes from the Strozzi Institute, which is kind of where I've done most of my training, is that in this work, what we're looking at is something that goes beyond that. We're looking at something that is actually much more about a cultivation of the self through the body. And that requires a different orientation of how we look at the body. And in this work, we're looking at the body not just as the site of emotions and the site of triggering and the site of all of that kind of stuff, but we're looking at the body as a representation of our history, a representation of our personality. And actually not as a representation of it, actually, that's incorrect, as our personality, as our history. The French philosopher Merleau-Ponty many years ago said, we embody ourselves. And that's essentially what we're looking at here, is that our personality is not a structure of the mind, but a structure of the body. And so when we look at the body, we're looking at working through the body on the self that we are. And we would see in this work that the mental processes, the emotional processes, and the physical processes are basically one process which we experience at 3 different levels, rather than 3 different processes. And so in this work, what we're essentially doing is using the body as our entry point into all of that. We use the body as our entry point into how do we cultivate a self which can fulfill on what we care about, which moves us towards the future that we want to create in our lives. And when we're coaching people, our job as coaches is to help somebody through the body be able to move through to what they care about, be able to cultivate a self that enables them to move towards what they care about. So that's kind of the orientation that we come from in this work. Why do we hold that? Well, if we take a very simple, if I take a very simple demonstration for a moment, if you want to stop yourself crying, there's a very simple series of things that you can do if you're feeling emotional and you want to stop yourself crying. You tighten on your diaphragm, you bring your breathing up into your upper chest, you tighten around the jaw and throat, and you tighten around the eyes. And you do that fairly unconsciously if you want to stop yourself crying. It's not like you think, oh, I need to tighten my diaphragm or I need to start breathing in a shallow way. It's just what we do. We stop ourselves crying. It does two things for us, two essential things. The first one is that it stops the physical release of the emotion. It stops us actually releasing the emotion. We're holding back the tears. We're holding back whatever it is we're experiencing. And the second really important thing it does for us is that when we tense up like that, we numb ourselves. We become numb and we don't feel. So we start to numb some of the pain that is causing us to feel that emotion. Now, if you meet somebody, many men in our society who haven't cried in 30 years, you could, what you'll discover is that they have a long-term pattern of holding, a long-term pattern of holding in the diaphragm, a long-term pattern of shallow breathing, a long-term pattern of holding at the jaw and throat and holding at the eyes. Now, linguistically, and in the linguistic traditions, you could treat that as a repression or a suppression of emotions, or a retroflexion of emotions, depending on how you orient with it. You can treat it in many different ways. Or we can say that here's a long-term pattern of holding. A long-term pattern of holding that gives this person a certain shape to their reality. That gives this certain person a certain emotional range. And inside of a certain emotional range, certain possibilities are available to us. Like probably not the possibility to empathize in this case. Probably not the possibility to connect with other people in their pain. So we can see that this leads to thoughts, it leads to actions, it leads to a range of possibilities in the world. And I've done that with suppressing emotions, but I can do that for basically any aspect of personality. We hold our personality in the constrictions of our tissues. And as we constrict our tissues in order to allow ourselves to feel and to experience a certain range of things in the world, that gives us certain possibilities in the world. And so our work is to start to go, we work through the body in order to release some of these contractions, in order to enable a different emotional range, in order to enable a different possibilities for action. And that's how we move a client towards what it is that they care about. And so in this work, we're very much exploring how do we do that? How do we take an intuitive hit that we have about a client that actually there's something that we kind of sense about them? And how do we ground that inside of the physical body that we see? And then how do we work with some practices that allow them to cultivate a different body and therefore a different self? And I'm not talking about, going to a gym and doing weights. I'm not talking about anything like that. I'm talking about how do they cultivate the capacity to be open and connected with people? How do they cultivate the capacity not to collapse in the face of conflict and disappear? How do they cultivate the capacity to be warm and empathetic in a moment where they feel triggered and threatened? And how do they cultivate the ability to do that consistently and when under pressure? And that's the level of learning that we're looking for in this work. It's not that you kind of cognitively know there are some things you could do better, but that actually instinctively, habitually, you can embody a different characteristic. You cultivate a self that in future can go into this situation of conflict and will no longer collapse and withdraw from the conflict, but actually can stay present and take a stand for what you care about, for example. And that's the journey of learning that we go on. So that's just to give you a sense of the conversation of somatics that we're in here. This orientation to somatics draws on lots and lots of different strands. It draws on a strand of work which comes from the martial arts. It draws on strands of work which come from Gestalt psychotherapy, but also from body-oriented psychotherapies such as polarity therapy, Feldenkrais, Rolfing, all of those kind of body-oriented traditions. It draws on the linguistic distinctions which sit at the root of a lot of coaching, which were developed by, among others, Fernando Flores, and some of the linguistic distinctions that tie into our bodily capabilities. And it draws on a range of other kind of people who've developed ideas within the somatic domain, such as Alexander technique or bioenergetics, all of those different strands of work. And so my teacher in this work, Richard Strozzi Heckler, was taught by many, many of those people directly. That's kind of where his lineage comes from. So that's just to give you a sense of where this comes from. Now I'm going to share my screen and share a PowerPoint, which is very unusual to do PowerPoints in this work, I have to say. But as we're talking about a coaching program, it felt appropriate to show some models. And so I'm going to show some models, and I beg forgiveness, because that's an embodied work. Often we do more experiential stuff, but it feels appropriate here. So let's see, share. Okay, can everybody see that?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So what I want to do first of all is look at this slide, which is the somatic methodology. And to give you a little bit of sense of what we're looking at inside of this somatic methodology. Now, there are three core things that we're paying attention to inside of this work, which sit at the center of it. The one is somatic awareness. And the somatic awareness really relates to our ability to feel and experience what's going on inside the living tissues of our body as it happens. Can we start to develop heightened awareness of all the stuff that's going on that,
yeah.
Sorry, sharing is stopped for some reason. I don't know why. Is that still visible?
Yes.
Yeah, but just,
okay, good.
But just the first slide, not the other.
Okay, that's fine. That's fine. Just the first slide.
Pete, I think you're on the wrong slide, Pete. I think we were just seeing the somatic coaching webinar. I think we need to move to the next slide.
Okay.
You might just want to stop sharing and share again.
Yeah.
This happened to me the other day.
I think I'm going to need to. Let's see. Okay.
Now.
Stop sharing. Oh, did you get it?
No, yeah, we got it. Yeah.
Here.
Inevitably, it works when I least expect it.
Yeah.
Okay, so there we have it. We have a let's see, there we go. We have the model of the somatic methodology, if you like. So we've got somatic awareness. And so part of what we're looking at inside of that is to really understand the processes as they go on inside of our body. If we buy into the idea that it's one process somatically or physically, emotionally, and mentally, then what we really want to do is enable ourselves and our clients to really experience that as it's moving through our living tissues. And so there's a big piece of work which starts with somatic awareness. From that, we start to develop some level of somatic opening. And a somatic opening is that place where all of a sudden the history as it's embodied in our tissues starts to open up. And this is a really interesting place that we get to in this work, which is a place of, you know, when you wake up in the morning, you don't have to think about how to be you. Well, this is a place where sometimes we feel like we need to think how to be us when we wake up in the morning, when we're in somatic opening, because everything, the established ways of being in the world have kind of been broken apart. And we're sitting in this place of moving into something new, moving into some new possibilities. And that's the place of opening. That's the place where we're starting to look at what it is for us to move into a different possibility. It's for the person who hasn't cried in 30 years, it's that experience all of a sudden of their emotions and waking up one day and feeling their emotions fully and alive, without having all those barriers and boundaries in place that were historically in place, and feeling a whole different person as a result. Because our body is the first point of reference for how we experience ourselves in the world. And when we make that opening, all of a sudden, we experience ourselves in the world utterly differently. And that's the experience of somatic opening. And then there's somatic practices. And the somatic practices are the place where we start to take on practices that enable us to cultivate new possibilities. It's that place where, you know, if I've been in the practice of historically moving away from conflict and diminishing myself and collapsing in the face of it, it's that place where I start to practice what it is to take a stand inside of a conflict, to take a stand for what's important to me and what I care about. And that's the place where we move into new practices. And, you know, sometimes we have a desire to skip from somatic awareness to somatic practices. But often what that does is that means that we're putting practices on top of an old shape, an old way of being. And that will get us so far. That's kind of the attempt to learn new skills on top of an entire persona that we've developed that doesn't want to do them. You know, it's like developing timeliness skills on top of an entire persona that really does not want to do them. And it can help a bit, but it doesn't lead to transformation. It doesn't lead to embodiment of something new. And so the somatic practices on top of somatic opening lead us towards the cultivation of a different type of self. So that's part of what we're working with as somatic coaches, but we're doing that inside of a couple of really important things. We do that inside of social context. We are never separate from a social context. You know, often when we think about who we've become in the world and how we are in the world, we often tend to think about, you know, our parents and our family members as kind of like the origins of who we are. And that's to some extent true. And there's whole layers of who we are, which are represented by the social context in which we live. You know, did I grow up in a particular kind of community or a particular type of society? You know, growing up in a community that is at war is different to growing up to a community that is in peace. Growing up in a community of privilege is different to growing up in a community without privilege. Growing up in a dominant culture is different than growing up in a minority culture. Growing up in where we've traveled around the world and kind of moved around the world a lot as a child is very different as well than growing up in one stable place. And all of these things shape who we are. And so inside of this work, we can't really understand the cultivation of a self unless we understand that that's shaped by a social context. It's shaped by power and privilege and wealth and social class and race and sexuality and all of those different aspects. So that's an aspect that shapes the self that we become. You know, we become who we are based on how all of that impacts us. And then outside of that, we have spirit and landscape. And spirit and landscape refers to, you know, there's a difference between growing up in the country and growing up in a city. The landscape that we grew up in has an impact on us. And part of that landscape is often, there's a deep connection for many people between landscape, nature, and spirit. And so what is the way in which we are shaped in terms of spirit, and whatever meaning we can give to that at the very broadest level, that's about meaning. It's about purpose. And how are we shaped by that, our relationship to meaning and purpose, to some broader sense of who we are in this world. And so when we're working somatically, we're working with all of that. We're working with the self that comes in and how that self has been, and when I say shaped, I know I pronounce that weirdly because I'm Northern Irish. I'm using the word S-H-A-P-E-D, so the physical shape of something. When I use the word shaped, that is a shape of the self that we've become, which is the shape of our body, the shape of our physical tissues, and the shape that we have developed over time. And this is why that when you walk down the street, you'll sometimes get this sense of somebody as like aggressive, or somebody else as being shy. It's like we know intuitively that we can sense that. We know that children and animals know when we're upset sometimes before we do. It's like they're reading what's there. what's there in the living tissues. And so part of what we want to do is say, let's work with that. Let's pay attention to it. Let's build our awareness of how that lives inside of us. Because the great thing about this work as coaches is if we're paying attention, we can see somebody's history in their physical body, in their tissues. We can look at somebody and see how they have been shaped over time and how they hold themselves. The really bad news about this is that if people are paying attention to us, they get to see us. That's the bit that's slightly scary. It's like we don't have the image that we would ideally want to project into their head, that if they're paying attention, they'll see. And so in this work, we're kind of going, well, all of that is there. All of that is visible. Let's work with it. And let's see if we can, through working with that, make a difference to people. So that's the somatic methodology. In the program in May, we're going to be going deep into that methodology. We're going to be looking at how do we understand how social context shapes us? How do we move people through developing somatic awareness, facilitating somatic opening, developing somatic practices that help them move towards what they care about. And we'll be looking at that connection to landscape and spirit. That's the methodology we'll be working with. There's an arc, a timeline to this work. So, you know, for me, all coaching work for me needs three things to it. It needs a methodology, it needs a timeline where we move the client towards independence, and it needs a means of intervention or a kind of framework for intervening with the client. And so this is the timeline towards independence for the client. And so it starts off with a current shape the clients come to us with, which is their current reality. And we get into a conversation, which is what are they committed to? And, you know, there's two aspects of this conversation. The first conversation is like to really feel, to increase somatic awareness so that people can feel what they're committed to. Because often people are committed to what their parents told them was important, or what their family or the society considers to be important. But here what we want to do is really get in touch with what is actually important to me, and how do we develop enough somatic awareness that I am in touch with what I care about, with what's important to me, and that I can listen to what wants to come from within. And so we do a lot of work to get in touch with that. And what we know is that when we get in touch with something that is genuinely important to us, it is not the delivery, it is not the deliverables that we've already set in our day job generally for most clients. It is something that requires us to transform. It is something that if it's something we truly want, we truly long for, then it requires us to transform, because if it didn't require us to transform, we'd already have it. So it requires, it is calling out of us some level of transformation. And so that's part of the initiation of any of this work, is building some of that awareness, building some of that clarity on what people are committed to, and understanding the body as self, as transformation, and as a resource. Through that, we go then into looking at our conditioning. And we start to understand that we all have a shape to our conditioning, that we all have a way in which our conditioning is developed over time. And it developed in us, honestly, as a way to manage as we were growing up, to manage our needs for safety, for belonging and connection, and for dignity. You know, those are basic fundamental needs that we have as human beings. And part of what's happening as we grow up is we're trying to get those needs met in situations that are imperfect, with people who are imperfect. And so as we're doing that, we're trying to get those needs met in the best way we can possible. And we develop some reactions to the world as a result, let's say, some conditioning about how we shape ourselves in order to get those things. And that might be, you know, a please and appease type of personality that tries to get safety and connection and dignity through building relationship with people and appeasing and not taking their own concerns into account, for example. But we all have our conditioning. So we need to explore and understand that conditioning. And we need to not just understand it cognitively, we need to understand how it lives in the tissues. and how it shapes us in the moment and how it pushes us into a way of being in the world. And then we start to work with how do we find a way to be able to experience that from a place of choice through centering, to be able to experience our conditioning as it lives in our tissues from a place of choice about the actions that we take. And as we do that, we start to move into some somatic opening. And that's the place where we start to disorganize some of those historic narratives, some of that historic conditioning. And we start to release some of those patterns that have held us over a period of time. And we start to experience an increased emotional range. People start to feel a little disorganized and a little bit kind of discombobulated. And from there, we move into an increased level of connection, trust, connection to both ourselves and to others. We start to have the possibility of conflict as generative, because I'm no longer being driven by my histories. And then we get into embodied new practices that move me towards cultivating the self that I want to cultivate and towards the future that I want to move towards. So that's the journey, the arc that we go through, the timeline of transformation that we go through in this work. And it's a journey that, it's presented as a linear journey. And I think most of us as coaches will know that nothing is ever as linear as it is in a model. So it isn't. Acknowledge that. But it gives us a sense of the stages that we go through in helping somebody move towards the future that they care about. And of course, there's always the possibility of going around the cycle multiple times, as there is in all coaching. But that's the arc of transformation, the arc of development that we go through. And so what we want to do inside of the program in May is explore what it is to bring somebody through that arc. Explore what it is to bring people through as a coachee, to bring them through the stages somatically, to help them develop that awareness, that understanding of the conditioned tendency as it lives in their tissues, to that place where they let go of some of that historic patterns, those historic places of holding and tension in the body, to developing connection and new practices that move them towards the future that they want to generate. And there's a beautiful process as we bring people through somatic coaching where, as they take on new practices, there are these moments of realization where all of a sudden they realize that they're taking new actions that have just become utterly obvious to them, that historically were utterly not obvious. That their new shape, the new self that they have developed, is engaging in different possibilities, is engaging in taking different actions in the world in a kind of automatic way, in a way that is starting to become embodied. And that's really what we want to cultivate in this work, or what we want to do in this work, is bring people to that place. So I've just muted Marita because there was some background noise there. Okay, so that's the arc of transformation. And then the final thing that we'll be doing is, inside of this work, is to start to explore what are the interventions that we make somatically with people in order to get them there. How do we do this? What are the things that we do and say with clients in order to help them move through this arc of transformation? The practices that we might develop, the awareness practices, the new practices for developing new competencies, the ways in which we can work with a conditioned tendency. All of that stuff is the final part of what we look at here in this work. What are the interventions? So those three things are essentially what the program in May is based around, is helping to understand those three different aspects.
So Pete, maybe you want to stop the screen share, and there's a question about what do you mean? There you go. Yeah, and then there's a question about from somebody, what do you mean by our condition? That came up.
Our conditioning. Let me just. What do you mean by our conditioning? So by that, I think I was referring to the conditioned tendency. Conditioned tendency. So our conditioned tendency is our history, basically. It tends to be that it develops into our conditioned response to pressure. What I mean by that is, like, as we go through life, what happens to as a young person growing up in the world, what happens to us is we find ourselves in situations where we're trying to meet our needs for safety, for dignity, and for belonging. And we can arrive in situations where somehow those needs aren't being met. And we need to try to get those needs met. And often what we do is we start to take on certain behaviors, certain ways of being, in order to try to get those needs met. So, for example, if I'm not getting my needs for belonging or safety met, I might start to develop a way of pleasing and appeasing people in order to feel like I am that I can generate some level of belonging, some level of safety in relationships with others. And that may be a really appropriate thing to learn at that point in our lives. You know, we all acquire our conditioning honestly, in that we acquire it as a genuine attempt as a developing ego to be able to find a way to get our needs met. However, if we go on 30 years and that is our way of being in the world, and we don't know how to take a stand for what we care about or express our needs effectively, then that becomes very limiting in terms of somebody moving towards the future that they want. And so there are all sorts of ways in which we are shaped by our history. And that's what we call our conditioning, or our conditioned tendency. And part of what we look at in this work is how that is held in the tissues, how that is held in the muscles. There's another question, which is, do you hold our brain and thought pattern in the tissues too? Really interesting. So one of the things that we would say in this work is that everything starts with the body. And what I mean by that is our body will be experiencing a certain, we'll be having a certain experience. We will feel certain things in our body, certain tensions, certain, whatever it is. And then what happens is we put a label on that and we give it an emotional name. You know, we experience our emotions in our tissues. And our emotions tend to drive our thinking, or our mood and emotions, our affective world will drive our thinking. So if you think about it, if we're in an ambitious mood or an optimistic mood, we will have a different series of thoughts than if we are in a resigned and cynical mood, if we're living inside of that mood. So inside of this work, part of what we're looking at is the idea that moods and emotions are bodily phenomena. They live inside of our tissues. And the moods and emotions drive our thinking. The really interesting thing is that, you know, there is a lot of ways in which the body and both the hormonal balance of the body and the neurons from the body will impact on the brain and impact on thought patterns, to the extent that many neuroscientists will now say that they don't know where the brain ends and the body begins, which is a really interesting thing to think about. So equally as our body is shaped by our conditioning and our muscles are shaped by our conditioning, we know from neuroplasticity that our brain is shaped by our thinking. And if we don't really know where one ends and the other begins, then the body-brain thing, if we don't want to separate it, we don't want to get into body-brain dualism equally as we don't want to get into mind-body dualism. In that case, yeah, it's all one thing, and it's shaped by our experiences, it's shaped by our practices, it's shaped by who we have become over time. That's a long answer to that, but yes, basically, is the short answer. Any other questions? Feel free to come off mute.
Yes, Martha here. So you said something about cultivating the new self.
Hmm.
So I'm curious what you mean by that. Is it like when you do this kind of work that you release the old stuff and then create a new self? Or is it, because we always will have the awareness how it was before. So I'm kind of.
So let me recontextualize that, because that's, I can be more precise in language about what I said. So we are born into this world, and one of the things that I would say is that we are born into this world, and life wants to do something through us, would be my view on things. And that's a connection to meaning and spirit and all of that sort of stuff. But that would be my view. Life wants to do something through us. And as we develop in this world, we develop our conditioning, which in many respects can block off our ability to feel what life wants to move through us and to be effective in trying to do that in the world. And that conditioning we can variously refer to as a persona or a personality. But that's the personality that we've cultivated over time. And when we look at this work, what we're looking at doing is, how do we start to cultivate a way of being in the world that allows us a greater connection to what life wants to move through us, and that gives us the personality characteristics that are likely to enable us to be able to deliver on that. Does that make more sense?
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
There's a couple of other questions in here. One is about the logistics and how the actual course is run. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that with the dates and how the course unfolds.
Sure. So the dates are basically, it's going to be 4 mornings. There's going to be 2 sets of mornings that are a day apart. So kind of the 6th and 7th of May. And then the second set is the 24th and 25th of May. So 2 sets of mornings from 9 to 1 p.m., 9 a.m. to 1 p.m. CET, just to be clear about time zones. And in the course, what we'll be doing is spending time understanding this methodology, both for ourselves and how we apply it to clients. And we'll be doing that through doing quite a lot of practice time, quite a lot of time where we actually start to pair up and engage with each other around, so how do I do this? How do I actually start to explore this principle with you? And then bringing that then into practice because we've got the 2 sets of 2 days. In between time, there'll be some work to do with clients and applying it to clients, and then bringing that back into the second set of 2 days. So that's the overall kind of structure of it. It will be hopefully very practical. There will be an element of it which is about us, because I think any coaching program has to be. And if you're applying the methodology to each other in pairs as you practice, inevitably there's a part of that becomes about us. But also because there is something about, we can't take any people to places we haven't gone ourselves. And so there's something about the practicality of going through some of these processes for ourselves that becomes really important before we bring those to other people. Does that give enough, Clark, or
Yeah,
I'm trying to be aware of time?
Yeah, and also you're going to be doing quite a few demonstrations.
Yeah.
Well, so they'll be able to see you doing it, and then the practice will follow, and then also discussions. And plus, there's a really in-depth manual that also goes along with this.
Yeah, everybody loves a good manual.
It's good reading.
More models for the shelf. Yeah, no, there's a manual, there's materials that go along with it. There'll be theories, there'll be practice, there'll be demos, all of that good stuff. Okay, anything else?
Great, I think that's what we have time.
Just quickly, I'm very curious, are there somatic coaches that we could work with just to experience the methodology on ourselves?
Yes, there are. there are some somatic coaches who you could work with in order to do that. So the best place to go is Strozzi Institute's website. They will have a list of somatic coaches. Or actually, Sergio, you and Clark, you probably have some somatic coaches who are based in Spain if anybody's looking for, unfortunately, I don't speak Spanish. So if you're looking for somebody who speaks Spanish as a native language, yeah, I'm sure Clark and Sergio will be able to point you in the right direction. But yes, and there are loads of somatic coaches. There's quite a few in the UK, there's some in Ireland, there's some in Switzerland, Germany, Poland, and other countries. I mean, across Europe, there's yes.
It's a quick
Loads and
question.
loads.
Will we be certified as somatic coaches after, if we sign up with you?
No, this isn't a full somatic coaching certification program. So just to be, sorry? Oh, okay, maybe that was background. So this isn't a full somatic coaching certification. This is for existing coaches who want to start to bring somatic practices or somatic practice into their coaching work. If you want to do a full somatic coaching certification, that's a longer process. And that may be something you decide you want to do after this process, but it's a longer process. It takes more time than we've got on this program.
Great.
Okay.
So Pete, thank you very much. That was a lot of information, some great stuff, and so I appreciate you always, and appreciate the knowledge that you bring and passion that you bring to this work. And I thank all of you for being here. If you have more information, if you have more questions, we are available at Greenlight Go. So send us an email or get in touch with Sergio. He's also the master of this as well. We're happy to answer questions, and then we can, for some of you, we can, if there's some questions we can't answer, we can feed them over to Pete.
Happy to be put in contact with people who have questions. That's fine.
Great. Thank you, Pete. And thank you, Pete, for being here again. And we look forward to the course starting next month on May 6th. And thank you all for being here and being such open and receptive listeners. And I'm curious about this, and hopefully we'll see you in the courses.
Lovely. Thank you all. Bye-bye.
Have a good night.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.